Hey there, drowsy historian here. Tonight you're not a cowboy or a pioneer. You're not carving out destiny beneath endless skies or harvesting golden wheat under a hopeful sun. No, you're just another desperate farmer in the Dust Bowl, slowly turning into jerky under a heat lamp. Your crops are dying, your kids are coughing, and your breakfast has a texture that strongly suggests topsoil. The sky, it's brown. The wind, aggressively personal. And if you're lucky, you'll make it to the end of the week without choking on your own homestead. So before the next black blizzard rolls through and sands off the last of your optimism, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love hearing who's tuning in from around the world, and if you'd like early access to more slow, dusty declines into the worst parts of the past, and other perks like ad-free audio of these episodes, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. Now lie back, get comfortable, and maybe keep a damp cloth nearby. Let's begin. You came out here because someone told you it was paradise. Maybe it was a pamphlet, or a man in a dusty hat with a mouthful of promises. Maybe it was just the government dangling the Homestead Act like bait on a rusted hook. Either way, you packed up everything you owned, kissed your old life goodbye, and headed west into a horizon so flat you could see your own disappointment coming for miles. They told you the land was free. They told you the soil was rich. They told you all it needed was a little sweat and a good Christian work ethic. What they didn't tell you, or maybe what you chose not to hear, was that this land didn't like to be messed with, and that it holds grudges. It wasn't hard to believe the hype. The Great Plains were wide open and supposedly waiting for someone just like you. You could claim 160 acres for next to nothing, just by promising to farm it for 5 years. That seemed like a bargain. You didn't think too hard about why no one else wanted it before you. Maybe they just lacked your grit, your vision, your mule. Maybe they lacked the unearned optimism it takes to look at a treeless expanse of brittle grass and say, yes, this is where I'll build a future. The earth looked calm enough, passive, yours for the taking, and for a while it worked. You dug a house into the dirt because wood was a luxury and you were resourceful. You ploughed the land into long straight furrows, turning up thick black soil that smelled like promise. You planted wheat, the golden idol of the prairies, and it actually grew. You felt powerful, godlike. The rain came just often enough to lull you into confidence. The wind was constant. Yes, but it was a whisper then, not yet the screaming banshee it would become. You told yourself this was the good life. You told your neighbours too, not that they needed convincing. Everyone out here was selling the same story, that this land had finally been tamed and you were the ones who did it. What you didn't realise was that the land was only playing dead. You were part of a generation that believed in improvement, that nature could be bent into submission if you just threw enough steel and sweat at it. The plough was your weapon. The tractor was your warhorse. And the wind? The wind was just background noise. You stripped away the native grasses that had held the earth together for millennia, replacing them with endless rows of wheat, because wheat paid. During World War I, prices soared. Wheat wasn't just a crop, it was a patriotic duty. Wheat will win the war, they said, and you believed it, because it sounded better than debt will win your soul. The war ended, but your farming didn't. Wheat prices dropped, but your ambition didn't. So you planted more, everyone did. More acres, more machines, more yield. The grass was gone, the roots were gone, and the soil was starting to feel a little naked, but no one cared. You were feeding the nation. You were a backbone of America. You were a human buzzword. Independence, hard work, progress. And you were digging your own grave, one furrow at a time. Somewhere in the distance, an old man probably muttered something about cycles, about droughts, about not trusting good years too much. You ignored him. He didn't own a Model T, and he still used horses. He was obviously a relic. You, on the other hand, were the future. You didn't need superstition, you had science. and science at that time was very busy telling you that rain follows the plough, that if you disturbed the soil enough, the sky would reward you, that you could summon weather with effort alone, which is an impressive level of confidence for someone who couldn't even predict next Thursday. Of course, what you were really summoning was a reckoning. You just didn't know it yet. For now, there was plenty of sunshine, the kind that bakes your skin into leather and bleaches your optimism a nice crisp white. Your family grew, your debts grew faster, you expanded your fields, because what else were you going to do? Stop? You were already in too deep financially and physically, and besides, this was America, the land of self-made men, bootstraps, and relentless forward motion. You didn't have time to look back. You didn't even have time to look down. If you had, you might have noticed that the soil was starting to lose its weight, its grip, its purpose. But hindsight is for people with time to think. You were too busy chasing yields, praying for prices to rebound, and keeping your livestock from eating your shirt. You still believed, deep down, that next year would be better, that the rain would return, that the wind would behave, that the land would keep giving. Because you were an American farmer, and American farmers don't fail. Not unless the sky falls. Not unless the ground rises up. Not unless the very earth you broke turns around and breaks you back. Which, inconveniently, is exactly what's about to happen. The first time you ploughed it, the land practically sighed. It didn't fight back. Not at first. The earth split open easily, like it had been waiting centuries for someone with iron blades and self-confidence to come along and carve it into submission. You'd never seen soil so dark, so rich, so cooperative. It rolled over your boots in soft, curling clumps, as if it agreed with your plan. It didn't, but it was very good at pretending. You got good at it too, breaking sod, straightening lines, covering acres in perfect rows that glinted gold in your imagination. You started with horses, then traded up for a tractor as soon as you could. The Fordson was loud, clunky, and just powerful enough to make you feel like a conqueror. You worked long days, sun up to sundown, your back turning to leather, and your lungs filling with bits of victory and dust. The neighbours said you had a knack for farming. Really, you just had the audacity to plant one thing and hope it wouldn't betray you. What no one said out loud, or maybe no one realised, was that this wasn't how farming had ever worked before. The prairie wasn't built for wheat. It had its own system, and you wrecked it with the enthusiasm of someone who's never read a science book. Native grasses had deep tangled root systems that held the topsoil in place through droughts, blizzards, and time itself. You tore all of that up like it was garbage. You didn't rotate crops. You didn't leave fallow ground. You didn't hedge your bets. Why would you? You had wheat, the miracle crop, the money maker, the golden god of the plains. Who needs biodiversity when you've got a grain that pays the mortgage? You didn't stop there, of course. Once you saw how easy it was to turn dirt into dollars, you kept going. You bought more land, or leased it, or just borrowed it under the assumption that you'd pay everyone back once the next harvest came in. You planted more acres, more wheat, more of the same. Thousands of others were doing it too. From Texas to the Dakotas, the same blades cut the same lines into the same exhausted soil. It was a miracle of modern agriculture, if by miracle you mean hubristic overreach on a continental scale. The yields were good, for a while, better than good even. They made you feel smart, capable, like you'd finally outwitted nature. You started quoting prices the way preachers quote scripture. You began to see the land as something that owed you, something that could be bent into usefulness forever, like a mule that never kicks. You didn't see the thin layer of topsoil beginning to loosen. You didn't notice the way the earth started to crumble a little faster under your boots. The warning signs were quiet, a little more wind, a little less hold, but the checks were loud, and that's what you listened to. There was no room for doubt when you were building an empire out of dirt. The banks loved you. The towns grew. Grain elevators went up like temples. Rail lines creaked under the weight of your optimism. Newspapers ran cheerful articles about the great American desert blooming under the farmer's touch. No one wanted to hear that maybe, just maybe, ploughing millions of acres of dry land to plant a single crop might be something less than a long-term strategy. If there were dissenting voices, they got buried in wheat, figuratively, for now. At some point you stopped looking at the land as something alive. It became a surface, a grid, a place to impose your will. You didn't walk your fields anymore. You drove them, engine roaring, dust in your teeth, skin red and cracked like the clay beneath your boots. You wore your sunburn like a badge. You joked about your dirt tan. You were a man of the soil, even as the soil quietly started slipping away. If you'd stopped to dig your fingers into it, really dig, you might have felt how loose it was getting, how dry, but you were too busy chasing yields, too proud to consider retreat. Every year, you doubled down. Every storm you ignored. Every small failure you patched over with more acreage. And every time the wind picked up and carried a little more of your future off into the next county, you told yourself it was just a fluke. Just one of those prairie things. You didn't notice that it was happening more often. You didn't notice that the air was starting to taste like earth. And you definitely didn't notice that what you were building wasn't a farm. It was a sandcastle. A big, beautiful sandcastle, made of credit and topsoil and denial. You thought you were taming the land. What you were actually doing was disarming it, removing the only defences it had, leaving it naked to the wind. But you didn't see that. You couldn't. You were too busy shining your plough. The 1920s were a con, and you fell for it like everyone else. It's not your fault, really. The decade had all the right illusions. The wheat was high, the skies were wide, and money seemed to fall out of the ground, like it had nowhere better to be. The war had ended, but the boom hadn't. You told yourself it was just the beginning. A new age of prosperity, driven by hard work and good soil, and the American way. You put on your best clothes for Sunday, kept your chin up, and planted more acres than you had any right to believe would pay off. But the wheat market didn't care about your optimism. The wheat market was global, erratic, and just smart enough to ruin you at exactly the wrong time. Europe started farming again after the war, which meant they didn't need your grain anymore. Supply ballooned, demand shrank, prices plunged, and you, standing on your borrowed land with your expensive new tractor and your shiny wheat thresher, didn't know how to stop. Because if the price per bushel went down, your only option was to sell more bushels, which meant planting more acres, which meant borrowing more money, which meant betting your entire life on a roulette wheel made of dirt. You weren't alone. From Texas to Nebraska, every farmer thought the same thing. It was a collective hallucination, a prairie-wide group project in magical thinking. Everyone believed that next season would fix it. Everyone believed that the wheat would rally, that the banks would understand, that the land would hold. And as a result, no one stopped. The tractors kept moving, the soil kept turning, the debts kept stacking. You weren't farming anymore. You were gambling with a shovel. The banks were happy to help, of course. They smiled while you signed papers you didn't really understand, nodding solemnly as you promised the future in exchange for the present. You borrowed against your land, your equipment, your grain, your body. You borrowed because you had to, because you had employees now, and a family to feed, and a reputation to maintain, because admitting that it wasn't working felt like failure, and failure wasn't something you could afford, not with the whole town watching. So you planted, and planted, and planted, wheat on wheat, row after row, season after season, the same land, the same crop, the same exhausted hope. Crop rotation was for cautious people. Fallow fields were for the weak. You were trying to survive by force of will, and that meant using every inch of soil until it gave up. Which it was starting to do, by the way. Not loudly, not yet, but subtly. The topsoil was getting thinner. The water table was slipping away. The grass was long gone, and the wind was beginning to pick up its pace. You noticed the dust, but you didn't talk about it. Not really. It didn't seem important, just a nuisance, a cosmetic issue, like dandruff, but for the earth. Your yield started to drop. You blamed the weather. You blamed the seed. You blamed God, a little, but respectfully. You didn't blame yourself. Why would you? You were doing everything right. The experts had said this would work. The government had encouraged you. The system had rewarded your effort. If it was failing, that wasn't on you. That was just bad luck. A temporary dip, a fluke, something to power through. So you doubled down, again. You weren't sleeping as much anymore. The nights were long and the air was dry, and the wind had started whispering things that didn't sound quite like wind. You sat up in bed sometimes, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember if your grandfather had mentioned this. He hadn't. Or if he had, you hadn't listened. You were too busy believing in progress, too busy building a life out of soil and slogans, and still the tractors roared, still the wheat went in. You were farming on credit and prayer, each season another spin of the wheel. You watched your neighbours do the same. Some left, some lost everything, some stayed and smiled too much. You wondered which group you'd end up in. Then you pushed the thought away and walked back into the field. You didn't know it yet, but you were already in free fall. The sky just hadn't caught up with you. There were no clouds to warn you, no thunderclaps of divine intervention, just a breeze growing stronger, a haze on the horizon that didn't quite look like weather, the sound of dry soil shifting where it shouldn't. It didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, a creeping failure disguised as routine. The good years weren't good, they were bait. They taught you how to believe in things that were never real, and they left you holding the bill when the dream collapsed. The land was tired, the bank was circling, and you were still out there every morning, sunburnt and grinning, absolutely certain that next year would be different. It wouldn't be. Not even close, and at first it was just wind. Not new, not special. Just the same endless prairie gusts that had always been there, pulling at your hat and howling past your ears like a bored ghost. You'd lived with wind for years. It whistled through the boards in your house, rattled your windows, scattered your laundry, and carried your voice away if you raised it too loud. It was background noise, part of the landscape. You didn't fear the wind, you tolerated it. But something changed in the early 1930s. You didn't know exactly when, but it crept in. The air got drier, the breeze got sharper, and then one day, the wind wasn't just moving through the land, it was taking pieces of the land with it. Little things at first, a fine gritty dust that coated your porch and settled in the folds of your curtains. You'd sweep it out and forget it. You figured it was a fluke, just part of the season. You'd seen dust before. You thought you knew dust. You didn't know dust. The drought started slow, the way all creeping disasters do. A little less rain 1 month, then 2, then none. The soil, already fragile from a decade of abuse, cracked wide open. You dug your fingers into the ground one morning and came up with something closer to powder than earth. Your wheat stopped growing. Your livestock started coughing. You joked about it at first, made dry remarks about the weather, and rubbed your aching back like it was all just part of the job. It wasn't, but no one wanted to admit that yet. Then came the first real storm. Not a thunderstorm, not a front with clouds and drama, just dirt, just sky and earth switching places. You saw it coming from miles off, a low dark wall on the horizon, moving toward you with slow confidence. At first you thought it might be rain. You hoped, absurdly, that it was rain. But as it got closer, the colour shifted from grey to a thick, menacing brown. It rose into the air like a mountain learning to walk. You ran to shut the windows, stuff rags under the doors, cover the food, the crib, your mouth, and then it hit. The world vanished in seconds. The light went out like someone had pulled a curtain over the sun. The air thickened. You couldn't see your own hands. You couldn't breathe properly, not without swallowing a mouthful of soil that used to be your field. You coughed so hard your ribs ached, your eyes stung. You blinked and tears came out muddy. Everything smelled like earth and fear. You sat in the dark with your family, listening to the wind scream and the walls groan, praying the roof would stay on and your lungs would hold out. When it finally passed, the silence was worse. You opened the door and saw a new landscape, your yard buried, your tools lost, your fence half swallowed. Dirt drifted up to the windows, like snow. It had weight, it had presence, it had decided to move in. You dug out the door frame, hacked up another coughing fit, and told yourself it was a one-time thing. You even laughed about it later. Everyone did. Gallows humour. That's how you got through the week. But it wasn't a one-time thing. The next storm came days later, then another, then another. Some big, some small, some that snuck in like burglars and some that hit like sledgehammers. You stopped being surprised. You started planning around them. You put wet sheets over the windows, kept water basins inside to try to trap the dust. You covered everything in the house you didn't want to eat later. You learned to chew your food without thinking about the crunch. You kept telling yourself it couldn't last, that rain would come, that the land just needed a break. Your neighbours said the same thing. You all repeated it like a spell, like saying it often enough would make it true. But the weeks kept stretching. The months piled up. The storms got worse and the wind, that old familiar wind, became something else entirely. It became a force, a thief, a kind of slow violence you couldn't outrun and couldn't stop. Outside, the fields flattened into nothing. Your wheat withered or vanished entirely, swallowed by dirt waves. Your livestock lost weight, then breath, then function. Inside, everything took on a permanent grey tint. Your sheets, your walls, your children's faces. You couldn't keep it out anymore. It got into your lungs, your food, your dreams. You started waking up in the middle of the night, coughing, gasping for clean air that didn't exist. You tried to carry on. That's what farmers do, right? You patched up the barn, redug the well, shoveled your doorway for the 100th time. You told yourself next year would be better, that the rain couldn't stay away forever. But you were starting to hear something different in the wind now. Not just a howl, but a warning, a whisper that said very clearly that you were not in control, that you never had been. Still, you didn't leave. You couldn't. Not yet. You had too much invested, too much pride, too much debt. And maybe, just maybe, you still believed that this would all blow over. Spoiler, it doesn't. The day started normally, which is how all the worst days tend to begin. You woke up with dust in your nose, dust in your coffee eye, dust in the creases of your bed sheets. The sky was pale and the air was dry, but that wasn't unusual anymore. You were used to waking up half buried. You got dressed, covered your mouth with a damp rag out of habit, and stepped outside into what passed for morning in the spring of 1935. Bright enough to make you squint, dry enough to make your teeth itch. You figured you'd spend the day checking the fence, maybe trying to plant something doomed, maybe just pretending this was all fine. April 14th, 1935. A Sunday. You'd learn later that they'd call it Black Sunday, because nothing sounds more biblical than a weather event trying to murder a continent. But at that moment, you were just going about your life, same as always, tired, itchy, vaguely resigned. You weren't expecting anything apocalyptic. You should have been. The first sign was the wind changing direction. Not just gusting anymore, but shifting, like it had somewhere it wanted to be and wasn't in the mood to wait. You looked west and saw it, a shape on the horizon, too dark to be a cloud, too low to be harmless. It stretched from ground to sky, a rolling mass of dirt and fury, moving faster than you thought wind could move. You'd seen dust storms before, but not like this. This one didn't look natural. It looked personal. The wall hit like a freight train. The light vanished in an instant. One moment, you were squinting at the sun. The next, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The air turned solid. Not just dusty, but thick, choking, pressing in from all sides. You slammed the door shut behind you, bolted the windows, stuffed rags into every crack. And still the dirt came. It oozed through the walls, swirled in the air, coated the furniture, buried your dinner. The world had turned into a vacuum cleaner bag, and you were the unfortunate sock that got stuck inside. Outside, it got worse. The wind shrieked like it had something to prove. Livestock suffocated in the fields. Chickens dropped dead in coops. Horses panicked and ran straight into fences they couldn't see. Inside, your children cried, their voices muffled behind damp cloths. You tried to calm them, tried to make it seem like this was just another storm, just another day. But your lungs burned. Your eyes ran black tears. Your hands shook, and the dirt tasted like copper and old regrets. It went on for hours. The temperature dropped. Static electricity built up in the storm cloud until blue sparks danced off metal surfaces, off doorknobs, off the tips of your own fingers. You huddled in the dark, breathing shallowly, hoping the roof would hold. You heard stories later of people who got lost walking from the house to the barn, of cars that vanished off roads, of families who tried to outrun it and didn't make it. One woman reportedly hanged wet sheets in her house to catch the dust, only to find them stiff with mud by morning. Another man tied a rope from his front door to the outhouse, like a lifeline in a blizzard. Only this wasn't snow. This was earth in revolt. By the time the storm passed, you'd lost track of how long it had been. 3 hours? 4? You opened the door cautiously, half expecting the outside world to be gone. It wasn't, but it was buried. A fresh layer of dirt covered everything. The porch, the well, the livestock shed, your sanity. The sun was back, but weak, pale, like it had just survived something traumatic. You breathed in the aftermath and coughed again. You were always coughing now, so was everyone. They called it dust pneumonia, a clever little phrase that made it sound almost clinical, like something you could treat with rest and water. But the truth was uglier. Your lungs were filling with fine particles of dirt, pulverized soil that had once been your livelihood. It clogged the airways, inflamed the tissue, and slowly suffocated people from the inside out. Children died. Elderly neighbours vanished from the porch and were found days later, crumpled and silent, mouths full of soil. You tried not to think about it. You tried not to notice that your own cough was getting deeper. Living through that storm was like being inside a sandblaster, set to maximum. Except instead of metal, you were made of soft, vulnerable human bits. Your skin cracked, your nostrils bled, you tasted dirt every time you swallowed. You woke up in the middle of the night gagging, your pillowcase damp with sweat and dust. There was no such thing as clean anymore. Just different shades of contaminated. And yet, when the storm cleared, you still went back to work. What else could you do? The animals needed feeding, the fence needed fixing, and the land, battered, abused, and now literally airborne, still needed tending. You told yourself it couldn't happen again, not like that. You lied to yourself, because the truth was too big to hold all at once. That storm was the worst you'd ever seen. But it wouldn't be the last. The wind had found its strength, and it wasn't planning on giving it back. Your house used to be a refuge, a little crooked maybe, drafty in the winter and sweaty in the summer, but it was yours. A place with walls and a roof, somewhere you could sit at the end of a long day and pretend, if only for a few minutes, that you were safe from the world outside. Now, the walls whistle, the roof moans, and the inside of your home feels like someone spilled a sandbox into every corner and then shook the whole thing like a snow globe. Every surface has a texture now, and not a pleasant one. The floorboards crunch beneath your boots, no matter how many times you sweep. The sheets on your bed feel like they've been dredged through gravel. When you sit down to eat, the first thing you do is blow the top layer of dust off your plate. It doesn't help. The second thing you do is chew slowly, because there's grit in every bite, and you're hoping to avoid cracking a tooth on the seasoning. Spoiler, it's always dirt. There's no part of your day that isn't a battle against dust. You've nailed wet rags over the windows and stuffed them into the door frames, but the dirt still gets in. Sneaky and patient. Like it knows you're losing. It settles on your shelves, in your hair, under your fingernails, behind your eyes. You can feel it lining your lungs when you wake up in the morning, coating your throat like a second skin. You cough so often now that your ribs are sore, and you've stopped noticing when blood comes up with it. It's just part of the routine. Cleaning has become your new full-time job, not that it pays. You sweep the floors 3 times a day, minimum. By nightfall, they're worse than when you started. You shake out the bedding every morning, and it makes the whole room look like a volcanic eruption. The dishes aren't clean unless you wipe them before and after eating. You keep a damp cloth near your mouth, just to breathe through. But even that smells like mold and soil now. There's no fresh air, just degrees of contamination. The kids are no help, but you can't really blame them. They're tired and pale and coughing more than they should. The older ones try to keep busy, but they're worn out from school closures and chores. And the younger ones have started turning the situation into a game. They call it, guess what's for dinner, but it's always the same thing. Beans. Dirt-flavoured, dust-garnished beans. Sometimes there's bread, if you're lucky, and the flour hasn't turned grey. Meat is a memory. Vegetables are theoretical. You caught one of the kids licking condensation off the window pane last week, and you didn't even have the heart to stop them. You used to have curtains. Now you have dust collectors. You used to have a pantry. Now it's a collection of sealed jars that still somehow manage to get dusty inside. You used to think of your home as a place where you could raise a family. Now you think of it as a structure that might eventually collapse under the weight of airborne soil. You've patched the roof so many times that it looks like a quilt. Half the windows are boarded up, not because of break-ins, but because glass can't keep out the earth anymore. Nothing can. You've stopped bothering with some chores entirely. Washing the linens? Pointless. Cleaning the chimney? It's full of dust, not ash. Painting the walls? You'd be better off sculpting them out of mud. You do what you can to maintain some illusion of order, because if you stop, you're not sure you'll ever start again. But deep down, you know the house isn't winning. It's absorbing the storm, little by little, turning into a tomb built out of splinters and sediment. You try not to think about how long it's been since you saw the sky properly. The sun still rises and sets, technically, but it's always filtered through a haze that turns the light an odd, sickly yellow. Indoors, the shadows are dull and flat. You've taken to keeping lamps on during the day, not because they help, but because they make the darkness feel slightly more intentional. Every conversation in the house circles the same topics now. When will the rain come? How long until the well runs dry? Whether the neighbours are holding up? And if it's time to leave. But you know you're not leaving. Not yet. You've built too much here. Left too much behind already. Besides, where would you go? California doesn't want you. And the East thinks you brought this on yourself. So you stay and sweep and cough and hope that someday the air won't feel like it's trying to sandpaper your insides. Some nights, after the kids are in bed and the wind dies down, enough for silence to sneak in, you sit at the kitchen table and stare at the lamplight floating in the dust. It looks almost beautiful, if you squint, like gold drifting through the air. Then you breathe in, choke on it, and remember that beauty's just what misery looks like when you've run out of options. You try not to look at your children too closely these days. Not because you don't love them, you do with every exhausted cell in your body, but because it's getting harder to pretend they're okay. Their faces are thinner than they used to be. Their cheeks have lost that round pink glow they had back when food was regular and the air wasn't a hazard. Their coughs are deeper now, dry and rattling, like the house in a windstorm. You tell yourself it's just a cold, or the season, Or maybe allergies, but it's not. It's dust pneumonia, and pretending otherwise won't make it go away. They sleep in the same room now, all of them crammed together under layers of blankets and damp rags nailed over the windows. You can hear them coughing through the night. Not the occasional tickle in the throat cough, but a steady hacking chorus that keeps time with the creaking of the roof. In the morning, their pillows are stained with reddish dust, and something darker in spots. You make them gargle water when there's enough to spare. Sometimes you even pretend it helps. School used to be a place of routine, of normalcy, of hope. Now it's a building that opens once a week, if that, and only if the air inside can be breathed without coughing up a lung. Teachers send home little paper lessons, mostly busy work, mostly ignored. Half the kids in town don't go anymore. Either they're too sick, too tired, or too needed at home. Your oldest is helping patch roofs and clean out barns. Your youngest plays in the dirt, not the yard, just the general atmosphere. You don't have the heart to stop them. You feed them what you can. Beans mostly, bread if you're lucky, sometimes soup, the kind that's mostly water and hope. You used to joke that the food had a little extra crunch. Now the joke doesn't land, because no one's laughing. Your children have learned to eat slowly, chew carefully, and drink with their mouths half covered to avoid swallowing the air. They're getting good at it. Too good. They're adapting to something no child should ever have to adapt to. They've stopped asking questions. They used to wonder why it was so dusty, why the rain wouldn't come, why their friends were moving away. Now they just look at you and wait for answers you can't give. You catch them watching you, not with trust, but with something closer to wary curiosity. Like they're studying how you're holding up, trying to decide if the grown-ups are still in charge, or if it's time to start planning their own exit strategy. You try to smile at them to keep the fear behind your teeth. They smile back sometimes, but mostly they don't. You tell yourself they'll grow up strong, tough kids, hardened by experience, resilient, the kind of people who survive anything. And maybe that's true, if they grow up at all. If their lungs don't give out, or their bodies don't wear down from too many meals that were more filler than food. You've stopped tracking their growth on the wall, not because they've stopped growing, though they kind of have, but because it hurts to mark the time like that. Each line feels like a countdown. There are moments when they try to pretend everything's normal. The youngest will draw pictures in the dust on the table, little scenes of sun and rain and trees that don't exist here anymore. The older ones build things, windbreaks, toy fences, sometimes just small piles of rocks, with no purpose other than existing. They don't talk about the storms much. They don't talk about the coughing either. But sometimes, in the quiet, one of them will whisper something to another, a question, a theory, a fear, and you'll hear just enough to know that they understand more than they should. You want to protect them. That's what you're supposed to do. You're their parent, their shield, the one who's meant to keep the worst of the world outside the door. But there's no outside and inside anymore. The world comes in whether you let it or not. It settles on their beds, seeps into their lungs, steals their futures a little at a time. You can't build a fence against it. You can't teach them how to outrun it. You can barely keep them clean. Some families have left, packed what little they had, and vanished down the road in trucks that belched smoke, and hope in equal measure. But you're still here, trying to hold the centre. Your kids ask sometimes if you'll go too. You tell them not yet, that the rain might come back, that things might get better. They nod, because they've learned not to argue, but you see it in their eyes. They don't believe you. And worse, they don't expect to. You used to think your kids would grow up and leave this place behind, that they'd become something more than you, smarter, stronger, safer. Now, you just hope they make it through the season. You tuck them in at night with hands that tremble from fatigue, whisper stories you half remember from better times, and try not to listen too closely to the wheezing in their chests. You tell yourself they're just catching colds. You tell yourself they'll be fine. And in the quiet after they've fallen asleep, you sit at the edge of the bed, staring at the dust gathering on the windowsill, and you think, maybe they will. Maybe. But not if this keeps going. You didn't think it could get worse. That was your first mistake. After months of coughing up soil and burying every ounce of hope under wind-blown drifts of what used to be your livelihood, you'd started to assume the worst had already arrived. You were wrong, because just when it seemed like the sky couldn't take any more from you, the ground decided to join in. And it brought grasshoppers. They came without warning, like most catastrophes out here. One day, you were staring at a pitiful stretch of withered stalks, the only green things that hadn't been blasted flat or swallowed whole by dust. And the next, the field was moving. Not swaying, not rustling, moving, crawling, seething, rippling like a sea of tiny legs and chewing mouths. The swarm descended so fast you barely had time to blink, let alone save anything. They came in waves, clicking and hopping and consuming, and by the time you realised what was happening, it was already done. Your crops vanished overnight. Not failed? Vanished. Gone as if they'd never existed. They didn't stand a chance. Drought had already left them brittle and dry like sun-toasted paper, and the grasshoppers treated that like a buffet. Leaves, stalks, roots, the husks of plants that weren't even worth harvesting, all chewed down to nothing. You stood there with a rake in your hand, watching your last food source vanish into the collective belly of a plague, and the only thing you could do was whisper a few words that wouldn't be appropriate in church. But it didn't stop at the crops. They ate everything. Grasshoppers aren't picky. They gnawed on fence posts, laundry, leather harnesses, and wooden tool handles. You found one inside your shoe, nibbling the laces. One afternoon, you came home to find them crawling on the porch, clinging to the doorframe, halfway through devouring the family Bible, like it owed them money. Your youngest swatted one off their sleeve, only to have another jump into their hair. You never knew whether to scream, cry, or grab a frying pan and start swinging. Neighbours tried all sorts of methods to stop them. Tarps, pesticides, hand-to-hand combat. One desperate soul stood out in the field, banging pots together, like he was scaring crows. It didn't work. Nothing worked. They just kept coming, unbothered, unstoppable, eating everything that hadn't already died from thirst or suffocated under dust. The most absurd part? You almost got used to it. That's the thing about plagues. They start to feel normal when you've got no alternative. Eventually, the government got involved. You were relieved for about 5 minutes until you saw the plan. Someone somewhere, probably very far from here, decided that the best way to deal with millions of ravenous insects was good old-fashioned fire. So they sent out crews with flamethrowers. That wasn't a metaphor. That was the actual solution. Men with tanks strapped to their backs, walking through fields with jets of flame, torching the swarms, like something out of a war film. You stood there, watching it unfold, wondering if you'd missed a sign somewhere along the way, maybe a pillar of smoke, or a river of blood, because this was starting to look uncomfortably biblical. The burning didn't feel like victory. It felt like erasure. Whatever hadn't already been eaten was now charred. The smell lingered for days, scorched weeds, roasted insects, dry heat, and desperation. The grasshoppers didn't even seem that bothered. A few thousand might have gotten crisped, sure, but the rest just bounced off and moved on, jaws still working. You learned quickly that nature doesn't scare easily, and it doesn't negotiate. You tried to find humour in it. That was always the last defence. You told yourself it was like something out of a joke, a dust storm, and a grasshopper walk into a farm. But the punchline never landed. The absurdity was too real, too close. You started counting the losses like poker chips. A shovel here, a row of corn there, another patch of roof eaten by wind and bugs and time. And still, you stayed. Because where else would you go? In the evenings, after the flames died down and the ground stopped crawling, you sat on the porch and watched what was left of the sunset bleed through the haze. You could still hear them out there, faint clicks, occasional thuds against the window, a sound like rain but wrong. Your children didn't ask what was for dinner anymore. They already knew. You tried to believe the worst was behind you, but deep down, you knew better. Because every time you said, it can't possibly get worse, nature took that as a challenge. At this point, you weren't even farming anymore. You were just holding space, a caretaker for the grave of your own ambition. And yet, you kept waking up, putting on your boots, and walking back out into the wreckage. You weren't sure why. Habit maybe, stubbornness, or maybe you just wanted to be there, standing in the ruins, when the next absurd disaster rolled in. That way, at least, it wouldn't catch you off guard. By the time the government showed up with real plans and funding, you already had a decent idea of what their help looked like. Men with clipboards and flamethrowers torching grasshoppers, like it was trench warfare. So when the next wave of intervention arrived, this time with jobs programs and science pamphlets instead of kerosene, you didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat. You were still coughing up yesterday's storm, still feeding your kids beige beans with a side of despair. But now, the men in suits were talking about soil structure and land rehabilitation, and that was just credible enough to make you curious. This wasn't emergency theatre anymore. This was strategy, or at least it wanted to be. Washington had gotten involved in earnest, and suddenly you were swimming in acronyms. CCC, WP, SCS. Men started showing up in uniform. Not soldiers, but labourers, hired through Roosevelt's New Deal to tame the land that had already devoured you. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees across the prairie, whole miles of saplings meant to act like a windbreak, as if nature could be managed with a neat green border. The theory was nice. The results would take years. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, was more immediate. They offered jobs, real ones, with a wage, a purpose, and enough structure to make the day feel less like a countdown. You weren't building wealth anymore. You were building ditches, sidewalks, fences, sometimes even outhouses. None of it was glamorous, but it gave you a paycheck. And in a season where your farm couldn't feed your family, a shovel and a ration ticket started to feel like a miracle. Then came the Soil Conservation Service, armed with science and an alarming sense of optimism. They handed out diagrams, spoke in words like terracing, rotation, and erosion control. You nodded along, pretending to understand, and followed instructions as best you could. Anything was worth a try. They told you to plant cover crops to anchor the soil, to leave some fields fallow, to admit that maybe, just maybe, farming everything all at once with no regard for the future hadn't been a sustainable plan. You could have told them that 5 years ago, but they hadn't been listening then. It wasn't that you didn't appreciate the effort. Some of it actually helped. You saw hills carved into terraces, seed drills that didn't rip up every living root, and fences that tried to slow the wind. You planted trees that bent in the breeze but stayed standing, and that alone felt like progress. But still, it all came with a bitter aftertaste, because by the time they showed up with their shiny solutions and expert advice, most of what could be saved had already been lost. And then, of course, came the photographers. They arrived like vultures in sensible shoes, government contractors sent to document the human toll of the Dust Bowl. They brought cameras the size of small children and asked you to pose in front of your house with your arms crossed and your dignity hanging by a thread. You stood there, trying not to blink in the dust, while your kids squinted behind you, coughing into handkerchiefs. No one asked how you were holding up. They just clicked the shutter and moved on. You saw the photos weeks later in a paper, your neighbour's gaunt face printed beside a headline about suffering, like he'd become the mascot of agricultural despair. You were officially part of history now, a symbol, a lesson, a headline, and you hated every minute of it. The same country that once cheered your ambition and bought your wheat now pitied you from a distance. You became the tragic image they showed in classrooms, the face they printed in magazines, The reason politicians gave speeches. You hadn't changed. You were still out here, shoveling dust out of your living room and hoping the well didn't dry up. But now your suffering had PR. To be fair, the programs didn't do nothing. The paychecks helped. The trees helped. The soil, though wounded, began to settle a little. You stopped losing entire acres to the wind. You even saw the faintest green shoots return in places you'd written off. The scientists weren't wrong exactly, just late. But no program, no wage, no diagram could undo the years of damage already done. You'd survived mostly, but only in the technical sense. Your land was no longer bleeding out, but it wasn't alive either, just dormant. And you were tired, so tired, of storms, of insects, of government names printed on official envelopes with promises inside that always came a little too late. You were grateful, sure, but it was the kind of gratitude you give someone who finds your house half burned down and offers to sweep the ashes. Necessary, a little too polite, and not at all what you actually needed. Eventually, there comes a moment when staying feels more impossible than leaving. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds, slow and quiet, like everything else out here. A few more sick days, a few more dead crops, another letter from the bank, worded just differently enough to feel like a threat. You look around at the dry well, the coughing kids, the half-buried fence posts, and you realise the land isn't just failing you anymore. It's evicting you. So you pack. You don't pack everything. You can't. The truck, if you even have one that runs, can only carry so much. You take the bedding, the tools, the pots that aren't rusted through. You leave behind the rocking chair, the books, the piano that hasn't been tuned since anyone felt like singing. You tell yourself someone will come back for them. You know no one will. You tie down what you can, lash it with fraying rope, and hope the whole mess doesn't come loose halfway down the road. And then you join the line, a slow dust-covered procession of tired faces and overburdened vehicles crawling west on cracked highways. They call you an Okie now. Doesn't matter if you're from Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, or anywhere else that got scraped bare by the wind. Out there, you're all the same. One big category of failure. The term is supposed to be geographic, but it sticks more like an insult. You hear it hissed at you when you stop for gas. You see it painted on signs, no Okies, no jobs for Okies, keep moving. You came looking for a second chance. What you find is suspicion. The road west isn't paved with opportunity. It's paved with the heat off your radiator and the hope you've managed to keep alive out of sheer habit. You ration food more strictly now. You sleep in the truck or under it, depending on the weather and how close the engine is to exploding. You get good at spotting ditches that pass for campgrounds. The kids are quieter, too tired or too hungry to ask questions anymore. When they do speak, it's mostly about oranges, but because someone told them there are orchards in California. Fruit on trees just waiting to be picked. It sounds like a fairy tale. You let them believe it. And then finally, you get there. California. It's greener, yes, and the air doesn't taste like soil, but you're not welcome. Not really. The locals see your clothes, your license plate, your truck patched with twine and prayers, and they already know who you are. You're one of them. The migrants, the squatters, the desperate. You didn't come here with money or land deeds or prospects. You came here with hands and empty stomachs. And California doesn't like beggars. You dreamed of oranges, the sweet dripping kind, fresh from the tree, so abundant you could eat, until your hands were sticky and your teeth ached. That was the fantasy anyway. That California would be a sunlit rescue mission. Fields of opportunity, clean air, fresh starts. Instead, what you got was wage slavery, heat stroke, and a long line of people who looked just as broken as you, standing in the same dirt, hoping for the same scraps. The camps weren't really camps, not in the way you'd pictured. They were more like organised squalor, rows of makeshift shacks, tents held together with twine, an old billboard canvas, floors made of mud when it rained and baked clay when it didn't. You shared space with dozens of other families, all of them coughing, hungry, and increasingly short-tempered. Privacy wasn't even a concept anymore. You changed clothes behind a blanket. You used the bathroom in a trench. You cooked over a shared fire and hoped no one took your pot while your back was turned. Everything smelled like a combination of smoke, mildew, and desperation. The flies were constant. The water was questionable. Disease passed through like it was collecting rent. If someone in the next shack started wheezing, you all started sleeping lighter. When the wind shifted, it carried not dust this time, but the scent of human waste and overripe fruit, both equally sour in your nose. The work was there, technically, but it was never enough. You were paid by the box or the basket or the bushel, not by the hour. And if the crop was bad or the weather turned or too many other workers showed up, you earned next to nothing. It wasn't a job. It was a competition, one where the winners still barely scraped by and the losers skipped dinner. You worked sun up to sundown, hunched over vines and trees, sweat turning your shirt stiff with salt. Then you walked back to camp and stood in line for water you hoped wasn't tainted, and beans you hoped hadn't been there since morning. Your kids worked too, not officially of course, but small hands could move fast and no one in the fields was checking birth certificates. They picked berries and tugged at tomato vines, their fingers stained and blistered, their shoulders already bearing more than they should. You told yourself it was temporary, just enough to save, just enough to get out of the camp and into something that didn't leak when it rained. But weeks blurred into months, and the exit never seemed to appear. Locals treated you like a threat. They assumed you were stealing jobs, even though the jobs barely paid. They called you lazy, even though you hadn't stopped moving since you got here. They locked their stores, raised their prices, and watched you like you were contagious. You avoided town when you could. When you couldn't, you kept your head down, counted your coins twice, and prayed no one asked where you were from. The answer was always the wrong one. You tried to hold on to your dignity. That was the one thing the storms hadn't blown away. But here in California, dignity felt like a luxury. You were disposable, replaceable, a unit of labour. The people who hired you knew it. So did the people waiting in line behind you. You weren't building a life anymore. You were just surviving one. Sometimes you caught a glimpse of yourself in a window, thinner than you remembered, dust still tucked into the lines of your skin, eyes half closed from fatigue. You looked like someone out of a novel, one of those characters in the kind of book they write about suffering to make it feel noble. The grapes of wrath came out around now. Everyone talked about it like it explained something, like it captured your story, but the truth was Steinbeck didn't have to sleep on a pile of rags next to a coughing toddler. He didn't have to pick peaches for 2 cents a basket, while pretending he wasn't getting fleeced. It wasn't fiction to you. It was the part of the story no one wanted to write. The days after the plot ends, where no one gets a victory speech and no one fades out heroically. You used to think the Dust Bowl had broken you. But California just made it official. It took everything you still had, your pride, your independence, your name, and replaced it with a number on a worker roster and a reputation you didn't earn. You weren't poor with purpose anymore. You were just poor with scenery. And yet, you stayed. You bent your back. You took the work. You endured the slurs and the stares. You watched the sun rise over the fields and told yourself it was better than dust, better than dead cattle and dry wells. Maybe it was, but it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like purgatory with a better crop yield. Most nights you were too tired to dream, but on the rare occasion that your mind drifted far enough away, you'd find yourself back in the fields of your youth, where the soil was black and the future was unwritten. Then you'd wake up in your bunk, sweating in the heat, a beetle crawling across your shirt, and remember, you traded that future for this one. And no one was coming to trade it back. It didn't happen all at once, which was probably for the best. If hope had come like a lightning bolt, you wouldn't have recognised it. You'd have flinched, ducked, and waited for the sky to fall again, but instead it arrived in microscopic doses. Small changes, subtle shifts, just enough to keep you from giving up entirely, though not nearly enough to make you believe this was over. The soil conservation programs that once felt like a government experiment started to show a few results. Not miracles, not transformations, but signs. Terraces held the rain a little longer. Windbreaks caught more dust than they let through. The cover crops didn't die immediately. The land wasn't healthy, not even close, but it had stopped actively bleeding. The topsoil wasn't trying to escape every time the breeze picked up. That counted for something. Then eventually, the clouds came back. Not often, not generously, but enough to matter. The first real rain in years hit like a prank, a quick burst that turned the dust to paste and made your roof leak in 6 new places. But the second one lingered, and then the third. You didn't celebrate. You just stood on the porch watching the drops soak into the ground and thought, well, I guess that's something. You were too tired for joy. The crops still failed more often than they succeeded, but they didn't always fail. Sometimes a little wheat grew. Sometimes the corn didn't curl into itself like a dying fist. Your animals stopped dropping dead from thirst. You found yourself walking the field without that familiar knot of dread in your stomach. Not because you trusted the land, you'd learned better, but because your body didn't have the energy to brace for catastrophe anymore. Around you, other people made decisions. Some packed up and left for good. They sold their farms for whatever they could get, loaded their lives into trucks and drove towards cities that didn't want them. Others rebuilt, hammered new boards into old barns, bought seed again, fixed up the tractors with wire and spit and prayer. You didn't do either. You just stayed. Not rebuilding, not retreating, just surviving in place like a tree too stubborn to fall over. You still worked. Not the same kind of work, not the proud, optimistic, we're going to make this land ours kind. More like maintenance. You patched what needed patching. You planted what might grow. You filled in the gaps the storms had left, both in your house and in your memory. You didn't talk about the worst of it. No one really did. It lingered behind your eyes in the way you hesitated before stepping outside, in the way you tightened your grip on the door when the wind blew just a little too hard. The children somehow kept growing. Not fast and not in straight lines, but enough. They carried the same cough, the same weariness, but they also learned to laugh again. Awkward, brief little laughs that didn't quite make it to their eyes. They'd seen too much. You knew it. They'd grown up inhaling failure, eating rationed beans, watching the adults fall apart one crack at a time. But they were still here. And sometimes, that felt like the only thing worth noticing. You weren't grateful. Not exactly. Gratitude required energy you didn't have. It also required a sense of fairness, and you'd long since stopped believing in that. What you felt was something quieter, less like hope and more like muscle memory. You got up because you always had. You worked because something needed doing. You watched the horizon because it was better than looking at the past. There wasn't peace, but there was silence. And sometimes that was close enough. There were good days now, or what passed for them. Days when the sky stayed blue, the wind behaved, and your boots came back from the field without needing to be beaten clean. Days when the chickens laid eggs, when the bread rose, when no one coughed before breakfast. You didn't trust those days, but you took them anyway, pocketed them like loose change you weren't sure how to spend. Maybe they'd add up. Maybe they wouldn't. You never expected to feel settled again, and you didn't. What you felt was less like recovery and more like fatigue reaching a plateau. The crisis had stopped accelerating. That didn't mean things were good, just that they weren't getting dramatically worse every day, and that for someone who had lived through the dust, the drought, the plagues, and the pity, felt like progress. You didn't rebuild your house, not properly. You patched it, reinforced the parts that mattered, left the rest. The porch still leaned, the roof still creaked, but it held. So did you. Not because you were strong or hopeful or brave, but because the alternative was collapsing, and that took more energy than you could spare. Every once in a while, someone would visit from town and say something like, "It's better now, isn't it?" You'd nod. You wouldn't argue. But inside, you were thinking, better than what? Better than biblical annihilation? Sure. Better than sleeping in a shack built from junk wood and shame? Debatable. But better enough, you supposed. And that was the strange part. You weren't healed, you weren't whole, but you were still here. That counted for something, even if you didn't know what yet. You always knew you weren't the kind of person they built statues for. Heroes got parades, medals, and stories passed down through generations. You got coughs that never quite went away, a sun-damaged hat, and bones that creaked louder than your porch steps. No one wrote songs about farmers who kept breathing after everything else gave out. There was no plaque for endurance, no monument for quietly staying alive while the world peeled itself apart around you. When people talk about the Dust Bowl now, and they will, they won't mention your name. You won't appear in the textbooks or the documentaries. Maybe a blurry photo, if someone had a camera the day your truck broke down on the edge of town. But that'll be it. Your legacy, such as it is, will blow away just like your soil did. And oddly enough, you've made your peace with that. You didn't survive for glory. You survived because you didn't know how to quit. You were never a martyr. You didn't suffer gracefully or selflessly. You swore, you despaired, you raged at skies that refused to rain and dirt that refused to stay put. You buried things, crops, animals, hope. You watched your children shrink, your home rot from the inside, your neighbours vanish into the horizon with whatever they could strapped to the roof. You thought about leaving too, more than once, but you didn't. You stayed. Maybe not because you were strong, maybe just because you didn't know where else to go. You weren't brave, not really. Bravery implies some kind of choice, a conscious decision to face fear and keep going anyway. You didn't choose this, it chose you. You just kept getting up, day after day, boots heavy with dust and stomach half empty. You told yourself you were waiting for the rain, or the recovery, or the miracle. But really, you were just waiting to feel like you mattered again. Like your presence on this land wasn't just a slow erasure. The land, of course, did what it always does. It endured, it adapted. Eventually, it even healed, or started to. The soil, once stripped bare and screaming, began to settle. Grasses came back cautiously. Trees grew tall enough to cast shadows again. The storms eased. The horizon stopped looking like the end of the world. But even as the land recovered, you didn't. Not fully. The wind still made you flinch. The colour of the sky still meant something different to you than it did to the newcomers. Your bones remembered what the weather forgot. People moved in again, some of them young, optimistic, full of ideas and energy. They asked questions about farming, about the land, about what it had been like back then. You answered politely, sometimes, but mostly you just nodded and let them talk. They wouldn't understand, not really. And you didn't want to be the ghost at the table. You'd had enough of being haunted. You kept to your routines. You fixed the fence posts that leaned just enough to annoy you. You checked the well, even though it hadn't gone dry in years. You still swept the porch, even though the dust didn't pile up like it used to. Habits outlived disasters. You didn't expect applause for that. You barely expected acknowledgement. There were moments, of course, when the past came back more vividly, when a dry wind swept in and coated everything in a fine, familiar grit. When a thunderstorm rolled in too slowly, and you stared at the clouds like they might be planning something cruel. When the air felt just wrong enough to raise the hairs on your arms. That's when it came rushing back. The storms, the hunger, the silence. Not memory exactly, more like residue. You'd lived through something that never quite finished dying. You looked around and saw the world moving on without you. Machines got bigger. Farming got louder. People talked about yield per acre and new irrigation systems. They called this land resilient, as if it hadn't almost broken, as if the cost had only been soil. No one talked about the men who coughed until they bled, the children who never grew quite right, the women who aged 20 years in 5. Those stories didn't get footnotes, they just faded. That was your role in the end. Not hero, not martyr, just background noise in a history someone else would tell. You weren't the villain, and you weren't the saviour. You were the one who kept going, who patched the roof, fed the kids, buried the livestock, and whispered to the dirt, even after it stopped listening. There was dignity in that. Not the loud kind, but the kind that sits heavy in your chest and never asks for recognition. So no, there won't be a statue. No song will carry your name. But if someone walks this land years from now and sees a windbreak still standing, a field still growing, maybe, just maybe, that'll be enough. Maybe you were the reason the next storm never came. The camera fades, not on a triumph, not on a grave, just on your boots, cracked and dust-caked, standing still at the edge of a field that finally stopped fighting you. That's how it ends. Not with applause, just with silence and dirt and the long, slow settling of everything you carried through the wind. Time has a funny way of smoothing things over. Decades pass, and what was once survival becomes folklore. The storms fade into statistics. The hunger turns into a footnote. People build museums now, little ones, roadside stops with dusty signs and audio guides that describe life on the prairie, like it was some kind of rustic adventure. They talk about resilience, hardship, triumph over adversity. You hear the words, if you're still around to hear them, and you don't bother correcting the record. What's the point? Tourists drive through now. They come in air-conditioned cars, wearing sunglasses and wide-brimmed hats, stopping to snap pictures of a reconstructed farmhouse that looks far sturdier than yours ever did. They walk through exhibits and point at rusted ploughs behind glass, saying things like, "Can you imagine?" And you nod politely, because no, they can't. Not really. They didn't wake up with dirt in their teeth. They didn't watch their children shrink. They didn't spend years wondering whether the sky hated them. The land has changed, but not completely. The wind still blows, softer now, but not forgotten. Every so often it kicks up just enough to sting your eyes and remind you what it used to sound like. The trees planted by those long-gone 300 boys are taller now. Their roots run deep. The soil clings to itself a little better. But if you stand in the right place, at the right time, and close your eyes, you can still feel it. That old tension in the air. The memory under the surface. The sense that the ground remembers even if you've tried to forget. People build new houses where the old ones collapsed. They pour concrete foundations and put in double-pane windows, and never once wonder if the floor will be buried by morning. They plant gardens in the backyards, water them with ease and call it progress. And maybe it is. Maybe the land is kinder now. Or maybe it's just resting. The ones who lived through it, those who stayed, those who made it out, are fewer now. Names blur together. Dates get mixed up. The details fade like the ink on a worn-out ledger. You've forgotten more than you remember, and that's probably a blessing. Memory has weight. Yours was already heavy enough. They say history is written by the victors, but this one didn't have any. Just survivors and a long line of people who came after, carrying stories that got a little cleaner every time they were told. You were never the main character, just one of millions who ate dust and called it dinner. No tragedy big enough for headlines, no victory neat enough for textbooks. Just years of gritted teeth, creaking floorboards, and stubbornness mistaken for strength. Sometimes a school group comes through the area, kids on a field trip, laughing too loud and squinting in the sun. Their teacher tells them how hard it was back then. The kids nod, uninterested, already distracted by their phones. One of them asks if the dust storms were really that bad. The answer, of course, is yes. but they won't understand that until the sky tries to take something from them. Until they live through something slow and cruel and relentless enough to leave a mark no photo can capture. You walk a little slower these days, boots scuffing the gravel, watching fields that still stretch farther than your eyes can follow. You pause by a windmill that's been dead for years. The blades rattle in the breeze, but they don't turn. You think about fixing it sometimes, then forget why it matters. You've stopped measuring your life in seasons or harvests. Now it's measured in quiet mornings, creaking chairs, the way the sun catches the dust in the air just before it disappears again. There's comfort in that silence. Not peace exactly, just absence. The absence of crisis, the absence of screaming wind, the absence of the daily grind of survival. You wouldn't call it happiness, but it's something like stillness. And after everything, that's enough. You'll be gone someday, maybe soon, maybe not. Either way, the world will keep turning. The wind will keep blowing, and someone else will walk this land, never knowing your name, never guessing what it took to hold the ground in place long enough for it to forgive you. Maybe they'll plant something. Maybe it will grow. The land remembers, even when no one else does, even when you don't. It holds your footprints in the shape of trees you helped plant. It cradles your story in roots and furrows and quiet. And it whispers, always whispers, even when no one is left to listen. So now close your eyes, let the dust settle, let the wind pass, let the silence stretch a little longer. That brings us to the end of tonight's long, slow erosion, not into disaster, but into something quieter. Dust, memory, and the kind of survival no one celebrates. If you're still awake, thank you for walking with me through the wind-beaten fields and hollowed-out silences of a life that was never meant to be heroic. If you'd like early access to more soft-spoken spirals through history's grittiest corners, along with perks like ad-free audio of these episodes, you'll find the Patreon link in the description. Feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about the moment you think you'd have finally packed up the truck. And if you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps others find their way to these videos. Sleep well.